Every waiting staff ran from the rude, arrogant billionaire, until the new black girl stood up to him. "Hello, my beautiful family, and welcome back. I hope you're all doing exceptionally well. Today, we have a story that I believe will resonate with many of you. It's a story about walls, the ones we build around our hearts to protect ourselves, and the unexpected people who have the courage to knock them down. It explores the idea that sometimes the loudest anger is just a cover for the quietest pain. So, get comfortable, and let's dive into this journey together." He was the billionaire who shattered people for sport, a man no one dared to cross. But when he met the unwavering gaze of the new waitress, he wasn't just looking at her defiance. He was facing the wreckage of his own soul. The silence in Julian Croft's penthouse was more than just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a heavy, expensive blanket woven from soundproofed floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, and a loneliness so profound it had a texture. From 68 stories above the glittering city, the world was a silent film, a majestic, sprawling map of lights and movement that he owned but could not touch. The distant wail of a siren was a rumor. The thrum of a million lives below was a myth. Here, in his sterile kingdom, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic clink of an ice cube melting in a crystal glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. Julian stood before the window, a silhouette in a bespoke suit that cost more than most people's cars. He was handsome in a way that was almost violent, sharp jawline, cheekbones that could cut glass, and eyes the color of a winter storm. But tonight, those eyes were vacant. He stared at his own reflection superimposed over the city lights and saw nothing. Not a man. Not a success. Just an outline, a container for the vast emptiness that echoed inside him. His thumb swiped across the screen of his phone, a compulsive, meaningless gesture. He scrolled past photos from a charity gala last week. There he was smiling a perfect, hollow smile next to a senator. Swipe. A yacht party in Monaco. Him again, laughing with a supermodel whose name he couldn't recall. Swipe. Swipe. He was looking for something, some flicker of feeling, pride, joy, even regret, but the images were as flat and lifeless as pressed flowers. They were artifacts of a life being performed, not lived. The phone buzzed in his hand, displaying a name that made the muscles in his jaw tighten. Father. He let it ring twice, a small, petty act of defiance, before answering. He didn't say hello. "It's done," Julian said, his voice flat. The hostile takeover of a rival tech firm, a brutal 3-month battle, had concluded that afternoon. It was a victory that had dominated financial news for weeks. "I saw," his father's voice crackled back, devoid of warmth or congratulations. It was the voice of a man who measured the world in profit and loss. Their stock plummeted 42% at closing. A bloodbath. Good. There was a pause. Julian waited. The approval never came without a price. "Now, about the Kensington property. Your last offer was weak. It showed sentiment. I taught you never to let sentiment cloud a negotiation, Julian." "The offer was strategic," Julian countered, the familiar cold anger coiling in his gut. "It builds leverage for the final push." "It builds the perception of weakness," his father corrected him, his tone dismissive. "Fix it. And Julian, don't call me again until you have." The line went dead. Julian didn't pull the phone from his ear. He just stood there, listening to the electronic silence, a perfect match for the silence of his home. "Don't call me again until you have." Not "well done on the acquisition." Not "how are you?" Just the next target, the next failure, the next demand. He was 34 years old, a king of the financial world, and he was still that 10-year-old boy standing outside his father's study, holding a report card with 5 A's and 1 B+, knowing only the B+ would be discussed. He tossed the phone onto a sprawling leather sofa that no one ever sat on. The emptiness inside him began to curdle, transforming into something sharp and restless. He needed noise. He needed friction. He needed to feel his power in a way that wasn't just numbers on a screen. He needed to exert his will over something, someone, and watch them break. It was a sick, ugly craving, and it was the only thing that made him feel alive. His fingers drummed on the marble countertop. Where could he find that friction tonight? A place with rules he could bend, with people paid to be subservient. His mind landed on Celeste, the city's newest and most exclusive rooftop restaurant. A place of hushed reverence and impeccable service. A perfect stage. "I'm going out," he said to the empty room, his voice sounding alien in the quiet. He straightened his tie, the handsome mask slipping perfectly back into place. The hollow man was gone. In his place was Julian Croft, the billionaire. And he was going hunting. 200 miles away, in a small, cluttered apartment that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, Amara Diallo was counting her blessings. They weren't listed on a stock exchange. They were taped to her refrigerator door. There was a photo of her father, his smile wide and grease-stained, standing proudly next to a vintage car he'd restored. A picture of her younger brother in his graduation cap and gown. A postcard from her grandmother in Nigeria, the handwriting a familiar, elegant script. Her apartment was the polar opposite of Julian's penthouse. It was small but vibrant, filled with thriving houseplants, overflowing bookshelves, and colorful woven throws. It was a space that hugged you back. Amara sat at her small kitchen table, a laptop open in front of her, transferring the bulk of her last paycheck to her mother's bank account. She left just enough for rent, utilities, and bus fare. A small pang of desire hit her as she thought of the new art supplies she'd seen online, but she pushed it away. The supplies were a want. Her mother's medication was a need. There was no contest. Her phone rang, and her mother's smiling face lit up the screen. Amara's own face broke into a genuine, radiant smile. "Hey, Mama," she said, her voice warm and full of love. "My Amara. How are you, my sweet girl? Are you eating?" Her mother's voice, a soothing melody, filled the small apartment. "I'm fine, Mama, and yes, I'm eating," Amara laughed. "I just sent the money. It should be in your account now." A sigh of relief came through the phone. "Thank you, baby. You work too hard. I worry about you in that big city all alone." "I'm not alone, I've got you," Amara said softly, tracing the rim of a photo frame on the table. "And how are you feeling? Did you get the results from your last test?" There was a slight hesitation that Amara, an expert in her mother's moods, caught instantly. "The doctor says everything is stable. No changes. Which is good news, he says." Amara heard the unspoken words. Not better, just not worse. The weight of responsibility settled a little heavier on her shoulders. That was why she'd taken the job at Celeste. The tips were rumored to be legendary, enough to build a safety net, to maybe finally get ahead of the endless cycle of bills. Enough to let her mother breathe a little easier. "That is good news, Mama," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "Now, I have to get ready for work. First night at the new place." "Oh, the fancy one. Be careful, Amara. Those places, sometimes the people are not so kind. You remember your father always said, 'Hold your head high, but protect your spirit.'" "I will, Mama. Always." After they hung up, Amara sat in the quiet for a moment, her mother's words echoing in her mind. Protect your spirit. It had been her mantra for years. She was proud and smart, with a fire in her belly that she'd had to learn to bank to control. She'd learned that in a world that often judged her on sight, her best defense was a calm, impenetrable professionalism. To be so good at her job, so flawlessly competent, that no one could find a crack to wedge their prejudice into. She stood and began to get ready, the movements of familiar ritual. She showered, the hot water washing away her fatigue. She braided her hair into a tight, elegant crown. Then she pulled on the uniform. It was simple but exquisitely tailored. Black trousers, a crisp white shirt, a slim black apron. The moment the fabric settled on her skin, a transformation occurred. The soft, loving daughter faded. The worried caregiver receded. In her place stood Amara Diallo, the professional. Composed. Efficient. Invisible. Armor on, spirit protected. As she rode the bus through the city, watching the streets get wider and the buildings get taller, she felt a familiar knot of anxiety. This was a different world. A world of casual, unimaginable wealth. She thought about the orientation, the stern-faced manager, Jean-Pierre, listing the Michelin star standards. He had a special warning for them. "There are some guests," he had said, his French accent sharpening with severity, "who require a delicate touch. Mr. Julian Croft is one of them. He is our most frequent and our most difficult patron. Do not speak to him unless spoken to. Do not make mistakes. Do not take anything he says personally. He is a storm. Your job is to be the harbor. Be silent, be efficient, and above all, be invisible." The bus pulled to her stop. Amara took a deep breath, the city air cool on her face. A storm. She could handle a storm. She'd weathered plenty in her life. She would be the harbor. Silent. Efficient. Invisible. She walked the final block to the gleaming skyscraper that housed Celeste. As she entered the staff elevator, heading up towards the sky, Julian Croft's private car was pulling up to the front entrance. He stepped out, a king arriving at his court, his gaze sweeping over the entrance with cold appraisal. Upstairs, in the bustling, organized chaos of the kitchen, Amara tied her apron one last time. Downstairs, in the hushed, opulent lobby, Julian stepped into the private elevator that would take him to the rooftop. The doors slid shut on both of them, two people from two different universes, rising 68 floors into the sky, on a collision course with destiny, neither one aware that the other existed. The storm was about to make landfall, and the harbor was waiting. We often build our professional identities as a form of armor, especially in intimidating environments. Have you ever felt like you had to put on a mask or a different persona to navigate your job or a social situation? Share your experiences in the comments. I'd love to read them. The air on the rooftop of Celeste was a carefully curated performance. It smelled of money, a blend of night-blooming jasmine from the manicured planters, expensive leather from the banquettes, and the salty, decadent aroma of truffle and oyster that wafted from the kitchen. Below, the city sprawled like a blanket of fractured diamonds, a silent, glittering audience to the dramas played out on this exclusive stage. And tonight, the lead actor was Julian Croft. After dismissing the sommelier with a flick of his wrist, as if shooing a fly, Julian's predatory gaze settled on his next target. Leo, a young waiter barely out of his teens, with earnest eyes and a nervous energy he couldn't quite conceal, approached to pour the mineral water. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he tilted the heavy glass bottle. A single, minuscule drop escaped the stream and landed on the pristine white linen, next to the base of Julian's water goblet. It was a flaw so tiny, so insignificant, that any other patron would never have noticed. Julian noticed. He didn't move. He simply stared at the tiny, glistening speck of water until Leo, following his gaze, saw it too. The color drained from the young man's face. "I am so sorry, sir. That was clumsy of me. I'll have the cloth replaced immediately," Leo stammered, his voice cracking on the last word. Julian leaned back, a slow, cruel smile playing on his lips. It didn't reach his eyes, which remained as cold and gray as the city skyline in a storm. "Clumsy," he repeated, savoring the word like a fine wine. "Yes, that's one word for it. Another might be incompetent." Leo flinched as if struck. "Sir, my apologies." "Your apologies are as worthless as your service," Julian said, his voice low but carrying with lethal precision in the hushed atmosphere. He picked up his silver fork, not to eat, but to use as a pointer, gesturing vaguely at Leo. "Look at you. Shaking. Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a boy who is utterly out of his depth. Someone who doesn't belong here." He paused, letting the venom sink in. "Perhaps you'd be better suited to washing dishes in the back. At least there, your ineptitude wouldn't be on public display." It was the final line that broke the unspoken rules of civility. It was no longer a complaint about service. It was a character assassination, a public stripping of a young man's dignity. Leo's shoulders slumped in defeat. His eyes welled with tears he fought desperately to hold back. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a statue of humiliation, about to shatter. The few staff members nearby suddenly found the floor intensely interesting. The couple at the adjacent table fell into a tense, whispered conversation. This was the Julian Croft effect. He created a vacuum of fear, and everyone scrambled to avoid being sucked in. Everyone but Amara. She had been watching from the service station, her body angled away, but her attention fixed on table 12. She saw the drop of water. She saw Leo's panic. And she heard every single carefully chosen poisonous word. Something inside her, a long dormant coil of steel, began to unwind. She thought of her father, a mechanic whose hands were permanently stained with grease but whose spirit remained immaculate, standing tall against the casual condescension of wealthy car owners who treated him like part of the machinery. She thought of herself, of the countless times she had swallowed her pride, smiled through gritted teeth, and absorbed the subtle and not-so-subtle slights that came with being a black woman in predominantly white spaces. She had promised herself she would be different here. Professional. Unflappable. Untouchable. But this wasn't about her. This was about a powerful man using his position to crush someone for sport. And in the face of that casual cruelty, her professionalism became a cage, and her silence felt like a betrayal. With a calmness that belied the sudden, furious pounding of her heart, Amara set down the silver tray she was polishing. Her movements were fluid and deliberate. She walked the 10 paces to table 12, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished stone floor. She didn't approach from the side, as a subordinate would. She walked directly to the head of the table and stopped, placing herself as a quiet, unwavering shield between Julian and the devastated Leo. "Is there a problem with the service, sir?" Her voice was low, steady, and devoid of the fear he was accustomed to hearing. It was a simple question, but in the charged silence, it sounded like a gavel strike. Julian's eyes flickered from Leo to her. A flash of annoyance crossed his face. He was a shark that had cornered its prey, and she was an unexpected dolphin, interfering with the hunt. "This doesn't concern you," he clipped, his tone a clear dismissal. Amara didn't flinch. She met his icy gaze without blinking. Her own eyes, the color of rich, dark coffee, were clear and direct. "With all due respect, sir," she said, her voice dropping even lower, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear her. "It does. Leo is a member of my team. An attack on his professionalism is an attack on Celeste's." The use of the words "my team" and "attack" shifted the dynamic instantly. She was not a mere waitress. She was a leader, defending her territory. A faint murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Julian's lips thinned into a razor-straight line. He was not accustomed to being challenged, least of all by a waitress. "Your team?" he scoffed. "Your team just spilled water on a $1,000 tablecloth and then stood there blubbering like a child. I suggest you take your team member and disappear before I have you both fired." Leo, jolted by her defense, finally spoke. "Amara, no, it's okay, Amara gave the slightest shake of her head, a silent command for him to stay quiet. She kept her focus entirely on the man in front of her. The city lights behind him seemed to sharpen, framing his handsome, cruel face in a halo of cold fire. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something sharp, like gin, was overpowering. She could feel the heat of pure indignation rising in her chest, warming her cheeks, but her voice remained as cool as the evening air. "He is a young man doing his best, Mr. Croft. He made a mistake the size of a teardrop. Your response, however, was a tidal wave. The silence that followed was absolute. It was no longer just a confrontation, it was a reckoning." Julian slowly placed his fork down on the table. The small clink of silver against porcelain was as loud as a gunshot. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not just a uniform, but the woman in it. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the unshakable core of integrity that radiated from her. She wasn't afraid of him. And that, more than anything else, was intoxicatingly new. This was the moment. The precipice. Amara knew that what she said next would either get her fired or change everything. She took a quiet breath. "We are here to provide you with an evening of exemplary food and service," she said, her voice clear and ringing with conviction. "We are not here to be the punching bag for your dissatisfactions with your own life. Leo has performed his duties with professionalism and respect. The only imperfection at this table, sir, is the lack of basic human decency being shown to him." Bomb detonated. The words hung in the air, crystalline and sharp. Dissatisfactions with your own life. It was a surgeon's scalpel, cutting past the billions, the bespoke suit, the arrogant facade, and striking a nerve deep inside him he hadn't known was still active. A nerve connected to the hollow echo in his penthouse, the meaningless boardroom victories, the ghost of a woman's laughter he could no longer quite recall. For a split second, the mask of the billionaire fell away, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something raw and wounded. It was there and then gone, replaced by a stunning, unnerving stillness. He didn't shout. He didn't call for the manager. He didn't threaten her. He simply stared, his gray eyes searching her face as if it held the answer to a question he'd forgotten he'd asked. The world around them, the clinking glasses, the soft music, the distant city hum, faded into a dull, muted roar. There was only the space between them, crackling with an energy that was no longer just anger, but something more complex. Disruption. Shock. And buried deep beneath it all, a spark of grudging admiration. A spark of intrigue. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke the silence. His voice was a low rumble, stripped of its earlier venom, replaced by a quiet, dangerous curiosity. "What is your name?" Amara's heart was a drum against her ribs, but her voice didn't waver. "Amara. Amara Diallo." He nodded slowly, repeating the name to himself, as if committing it to memory, testing the weight of it on his tongue. "Amara," he murmured. Then, with a final, lingering look that felt as though it were imprinting her image onto his mind, he made a sharp, dismissive gesture with his hand, not at her, but at the world at large. "At Leo." at the hovering manager who was now rushing over, at the food on his plate. "Leave me," he commanded, his voice flat. "All of you. Just leave me." Leo, guided by the now-present manager, practically fled. Amara held her ground for a second longer, their eyes locked in a silent duel. Then she gave a slight professional nod, turned and walked away. She didn't run. She moved with the same measured grace with which she had arrived. But once she was through the doors of the service corridor, out of sight, she leaned against the cool steel wall, closed her eyes, and let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs felt weak, her entire body thrumming with adrenaline. She was certain she would be fired by morning. A part of her was terrified, but another, larger part of her felt a soaring, unfamiliar sense of rightness. Back on the terrace, Julian Croft sat alone at his table. The perfectly seared scallops grew cold. The expensive wine sat untouched. He stared out at the glittering, indifferent city, but he wasn't seeing the lights. He was seeing a pair of defiant, dark chocolate eyes. And for the first time in a very, very long time, he felt something other than numb. He felt a jolt. The carefully constructed, orderly, and empty world of Julian Croft had just been struck by lightning. And her name was Amara. The moment Amara stepped through the polished steel doors into the service corridor, the armor of her composure cracked. She didn't collapse, but she leaned her full weight against the cool, unforgiving wall, the adrenaline from the confrontation finally hitting her like a physical blow. Her heart, which had been a war drum on the terrace, was now a frantic hummingbird beating against her ribs. Her breath came in shallow, shaky gasps. She had done it. She had actually said those things to Julian Croft. A soft scuffling sound made her open her eyes. Leo was standing a few feet away, his face a mess of awe, guilt, and terror. Behind him, two other waitstaff hovered, their expressions mirroring his. The entire back of house, usually a whirlwind of clattering plates and shouted orders, had fallen into a pocket of suspended, breathless silence. "Amara," Leo started, his voice thick. I don't know what to say. You shouldn't have done that. For me. He's going to have you fired. I'm so sorry." Amara pushed herself off the wall, forcing a semblance of strength back into her posture. She even managed a small, wry smile. "Hey, don't you dare be sorry." Someone needed to say it. She resisted the urge to tell him how terrified she was. She had appointed herself his shield. Shields don't tremble. "Are you okay? That's what matters." "Me?" he asked, bewildered. "Amara, he called me incompetent. He called you, well, he didn't know what to call you. You were incredible, like something out of a movie." A senior waitress, Maria, who had worked at Celeste since it opened, stepped forward. Her face was grim. "It was a nice movie, kid, but the credits are about to roll. Jean-Pierre is on his way to Croft's table right now. We all know what that means." She looked at Amara with a mixture of pity and respect. "You have guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't pay the rent." Maria's words were the bucket of cold water Amara needed. The brief, soaring feeling of righteous victory plummeted back to earth, crashing into the hard reality of her situation. Rent, her mother's medicine, her brother's tuition. All of it flashed through her mind. She had let her pride, her father's lessons on dignity, override the cold, hard pragmatism required for survival. For a moment, a wave of regret washed over her. It was one thing to be a martyr for a cause. It was another to be an unemployed one. She resisted the feeling, pushing it down. "It's okay," she said, her voice now quiet but firm, directed at all of them. "I knew the risk. I'll be fine." She was trying to convince herself as much as them. She mentally started packing her things, planning the bus ride home, rehearsing the conversation with her mother where she would have to lie and say the job just wasn't a good fit. Her spirit was protected, yes, but her future was now a terrifying blank. As if on cue, the doors to the terrace swung open and the manager, Jean-Pierre, strode in. He was a short, impeccably dressed man whose posture was as rigid as his starched collar. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His eyes, small and dark, scanned the cluster of staff and landed on Amara with the force of a physical slap. "Diallo. My office. Now." The other staff members melted away, leaving Amara alone to face him. She followed his stiff back to a small, windowless office that smelled of lemon polish and anxiety. He closed the door behind them, the soft click sealing her fate. He didn't sit. He stood behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back, looking at her as if she were a piece of filth he'd found on one of his pristine plates. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he began, his voice a low, controlled hiss. "This is not a public square for you to air your political grievances. This is not a stage for your personal heroics. This is Celeste, a 2-Michelin-star establishment. Our purpose here is to create an illusion of perfection for our clientele. An illusion you just shattered. With a sledgehammer." Amara stood straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She met his furious gaze. "Mr. Croft was verbally abusing a member of the staff, Jean-Pierre. I felt it was my duty to intervene." "Your duty," he scoffed, taking a step closer. "Your duty is to take the order, deliver the food, and remain invisible. Your duty is to uphold the standards of this restaurant, the first of which is to never, ever antagonize a patron. Especially not a patron who spends more in a month here than you will make in 2 years. You did not intervene. You assaulted him." "With words?" she asked, a sliver of her earlier fire returning. "He was destroying a young man's confidence for sport. And you decided to destroy your career for it. Noble. And foolish," Jean-Pierre sneered. "You are a liability. A loose cannon. I am going to Mr. Croft's table right now to offer him my most profound apologies and to assure him that you have been permanently dismissed. Clean out your locker. You have 5 minutes." He turned to leave, the verdict delivered. Amara felt the floor drop out from beneath her. It was real. It was happening. But as he reached for the doorknob, she spoke one last time, her voice soft but clear. "I don't regret it." Jean-Pierre paused, his hand on the knob. He turned back, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. "What did you say?" "I said I don't regret it. You can fire me. But I'd do it again." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head in disgust. "Then you are more of a fool than I thought." He opened the door and strode out, a man on a mission to put out the fire she had started. Meanwhile, on the terrace, Julian Croft was resisting something far more unfamiliar than a disobedient waitress, his own reaction. He sat motionless, the city lights painting patterns on his untouched plate. The words, "dissatisfactions with your own life," were on a loop in his head. They were a perfectly aimed arrow that had bypassed all his armor and struck the soft, neglected tissue of his core. He had built his entire existence on the premise of control. He controlled markets, companies, conversations. He controlled his own emotions, burying them so deep he could barely remember what they felt like. And then this woman, this waitress, had walked up to his table and seized control in less than a minute. She hadn't been intimidated. She had looked at him, the Julian Croft, and seen something pathetic. And worse, she had been right. The humiliation he'd intended for the boy, Leo, was now his own, curdling in his stomach. But beneath it was something else, something sharp and electric. Intrigue. Her defiance was a splash of vibrant color in his monochrome world. He replayed her face in his mind. The intelligence in her dark eyes, the proud set of her jaw, the way her voice, though quiet, had commanded the entire terrace. He should be furious. He should be demanding her head on a platter. That was the script. That was the role he always played. The anger was there, a familiar comfort, but it was thin, watery. It couldn't drown out the irritating, compelling echo of her voice. Firing her felt predictable. Boring. An unsatisfying end to the most interesting thing that had happened to him all year. It felt like admitting defeat, like letting her win by simply making her disappear. Just as he was wrestling with this unsettling new calculus, Jean-Pierre arrived at his table, his face a mask of supreme apology. He bowed his head slightly. "Mr. Croft, I cannot begin to express my horror and my apologies for what just transpired. The employee in question, she is new, inexperienced. She has, of course, been summarily dismissed. It will never happen again. Her behavior was inexcusable, an affront to you and to the very name of Celeste." Julian looked up at the manager. Here it was. The offering. The sacrifice. All he had to do was nod, accept the apology, and the disruption would be over. The world would click back into its proper, boring orbit. He could go back to his empty penthouse and his hollow victories. The resistance inside him roared. Say yes. End it. Get rid of her. He opened his mouth to give the expected command. But the words that came out were not the ones he intended. They felt foreign, forged in a part of his brain he hadn't used in years. "No," Julian said, his voice quiet. Jean-Pierre blinked, thrown completely off balance. Sir? No. No, Julian repeated, a little stronger this time. He leaned forward, his gray eyes pinning the manager in place. You will not be firing her. The manager looked as if Julian had just started speaking in tongues. But, Mr. Croft, she insulted you. She. I am aware of what she did. Julian cut him off, a new, cold authority in his tone. Her fate is not your concern. It is mine. He paused, the strange, new idea taking its final, concrete form in his mind. It was a power play, but a twisted one. A way to maintain control, but also a way to stay close to the fire. To study it. From now on, Julian Croft declared, his voice leaving no room for argument, Amara Diallo will be the only person who waits on my table whenever I am here. No one else. Is that understood? Jean-Pierre's jaw went slack. Of all the possible outcomes, rage, lawsuits, demands for free meals for life, this was the one that had never entered the realm of possibility. He was being ordered to reward the insubordinate employee with exclusive, high-stakes duty. It was madness. Sir, are you certain? He stammered. I am never uncertain, Julian lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. That is all. You may go. Stunned into silence, Jean-Pierre could only nod numbly and retreat, his mind reeling. Back in the service corridor, Amara was taking a final look at her small locker, a framed photo of her mother tucked into her bag. She was ready to leave, braced for the walk of shame past her colleagues. The door from the office opened. Jean-Pierre walked out. He didn't look at her. He stared at the wall just past her head, his face pale with shock. Mr. Croft has made a request, he said, the words sounding like they were being dragged from him. I'm sure he has, Amara said quietly, expecting the final, insulting blow. He has requested, the manager said, finally forcing himself to look at her, his eyes wide with utter bewilderment, that you are not to be fired, and that from this day forward, you, and only you, are to be his server. Amara stared at him, sure she had misheard. What? You heard me, he snapped, his own frustration and confusion boiling over. Get back to your station. Mr. Croft is waiting. He turned and walked away before she could respond. Amara stood frozen in the middle of the corridor, her bag clutched in her hand. The relief of not being fired was instantly suffocated by a powerful wave of dread and confusion. This wasn't a pardon. It was a sentence. He hadn't let her go. He had caged her. The storm hadn't passed. It had just changed course, and now it was circling, with her at the very center. Her resistance had failed. She had tried to walk away, and he had simply refused to let her. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare, conducted in the hushed, elegant arena of Celeste's rooftop terrace. Amara was no longer just a waitress. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, and Julian Croft was her warden. He came to the restaurant not once or twice, but 5 times. He always requested table 12, his throne, and he always, through a tight-lipped Jean-Pierre, demanded her. Their interactions became a strange, silent ballet of tension. The proximity was constant, but the emotional distance was a chasm. Amara performed her duties with a chilling, flawless perfection. She was a ghost in a crisp uniform. She approached his table only when necessary, her movements economical and graceful. She recited the specials in a cool, professional monotone, her eyes fixed on a point just over his shoulder. She filled his water glass before it was half empty, replaced his silverware between courses with silent efficiency, and cleared his plates the moment he was finished. She never spoke a word that wasn't required by the script of service. She refused to give him an opening. She refused to show fear, or anger, or even curiosity. Her face was a placid, unreadable mask. Inside, however, a storm of her own was brewing. Every time she approached his table, her stomach clenched. The scent of his expensive cologne, that sharp sandalwood and gin scent, felt like an invasion. His presence was a physical weight in the air, a low hum of power that set her teeth on edge. She was acutely aware of his eyes on her, tracking her every move. It wasn't a sexual gaze, it was something more unsettling. It was analytical, possessive, as if he were studying a rare, defiant creature he had captured and was trying to understand what made it tick. Her resistance was her silence. Her weapon was her professionalism. She was determined to be so perfectly boring, so impeccably invisible, that he would tire of his game. If he wanted to break her, he would get nothing. If he wanted a reaction, he would be met with a void. She would be the harbor she promised herself she'd be, even if the storm refused to leave. Julian, for his part, found her silence more maddening and more fascinating than any outburst could have been. He had expected her to be cowed, or perhaps resentful. He had expected to see a flicker of the fire she'd shown that first night. Instead, she had locked it away, presenting him with a polished, impenetrable surface. He would try to needle her, to provoke a crack in the facade. "The sommelier you sent over was inadequate," he said one evening, not looking at her, but at the city below. He didn't know the proper aeration time for a 98 Lafite. "I expect better." "I will inform Jean-Pierre of your dissatisfaction, sir," Amara replied, her voice as smooth and cool as polished marble. No apology. No defense. Just a statement of fact. Another night, he deliberately left his black Amex card on the table after signing the bill, a test to see if she would call after him, to see if he could force a more personal interaction. She didn't. She simply handed it to Jean-Pierre to be secured in the restaurant's safe, as per protocol. When he returned the next evening, Jean-Pierre presented it to him with a stiff bow. Amara never mentioned it. The game was infuriating. It was a duel where one party refused to draw their sword. He was used to people who wanted something from him, his money, his influence, his approval. They were transparent, their motives easy to read and exploit. Amara wanted nothing. In fact, her every action suggested she wanted only to be away from him. This complete lack of need gave her a strange, unassailable power over him. He was the billionaire, the king of the city, but in their small, silent war, she was holding all the cards. The tension between them didn't go unnoticed. The other staff watched from a distance, a silent Greek chorus to the bizarre drama. Leo, now her staunchest ally, would leave a cup of hot, sweet tea for her at the service station after she'd dealt with Croft. "For your battle pay," he'd whisper with a supportive smile. Maria, the cynical veteran, would just shake her head. "He's playing with you," she warned Amara one night while they were polishing glasses. "A cat with a mouse. Be careful he doesn't get bored and decide to use his claws." "I'm not a mouse," Amara replied quietly, rubbing a smudge from a wine glass with vigor. But she knew Maria was right to be cautious. This couldn't last. Something had to give. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. It was late, close to midnight, and a sudden, violent thunderstorm had erupted over the city. The rain came down in thick, blinding sheets, lashing against the panoramic windows of the terrace, which were now sealed shut. Most of the patrons had already left, eager to get home before the storm worsened. Only one table remained occupied. Table 12. Julian had been there for 3 hours, drinking slowly, saying nothing. He seemed different tonight. The cruel, sharp edges of his arrogance were softened, replaced by a deep, brooding melancholy. He stared out at the storm-ravaged sky, and for the first time, Amara felt that his gaze wasn't on the city, but somewhere far beyond it, lost in a memory. A deafening clap of thunder rattled the entire building, and the lights on the terrace flickered, went out, and then came back on, powered by the emergency generator. The sudden plunge into darkness, followed by the return of a dimmer, more intimate light, changed the atmosphere completely. It felt less like a restaurant and more like a shelter. Jean-Pierre, eager to close up, approached Amara. "Go and give Mr. Croft his bill. We need to close. The storm is getting worse, and the staff needs to get home safely." Amara nodded, printed the bill, and placed it in the small leather folio. She took a deep, fortifying breath and walked the final, lonely path to his table. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass was the only sound. She placed the folio on the table. "Your check, Mr. Croft." He didn't look at it. He kept his gaze on the rain-streaked window. "What do you see when you look at a storm like this, Amara?" he asked, his voice low and unexpectedly raw. He had used her first name. It was the first time since that initial confrontation. The question caught her off guard. It was the first personal thing he had ever asked her. It was a clear breach of their unspoken rules. Her training, her instinct for self-preservation, screamed at her to give a non-committal answer and leave. But something in his tone, a weariness that seemed to go bone deep, made her hesitate. She followed his gaze out the window. The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking the glass, driven by a furious wind. Lightning spiderwebbed across the black sky, illuminating the chaos for a split second. "I see power," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "And a good reason to be inside." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "A good reason to be inside." He finally turned his head to look at her, and in the dim, emergency lighting, she saw that the mask was gone. The billionaire wasn't here tonight. Just a man. A profoundly sad man. His gray eyes were clouded with something she couldn't name. "My driver is waiting downstairs," he said, his voice flat. "But the roads to the bridge are probably flooded by now. It could be an hour. Maybe more. And you live where exactly?" "The Bronx. Queens. Brooklyn," she answered automatically, thrown by the sudden turn in conversation. He nodded slowly. "The subway will be a mess. Delays. Reroutes. You'll be lucky to get home before 3 in the morning." He looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all artifice. "You can't get home. Not safely." Amara's defenses went up immediately. "I'll be fine, sir. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," he said, the words simple and direct. He looked back out at the storm, then down at his hands. For a moment he looked almost lost. "This is ridiculous. The restaurant is closing. You are stuck here. I am stuck here." He looked up at her again, and a decision seemed to settle in his eyes. "My penthouse is 5 blocks from here. The roads are clear in that direction. My driver can take you to the staff entrance. There are guest suites. You can stay the night, and he can take you home in the morning when the storm has passed." The offer hung in the air between them, as loud and shocking as the thunder outside. Amara's mind reeled. Go with him? To his home? It was insane. It was the most dangerous, reckless, and inappropriate suggestion she could possibly imagine. It shattered every professional boundary that had ever existed. "Absolutely not," she said, the words coming out sharper than she'd intended. The fear and indignation she'd been suppressing for 2 weeks finally surfaced. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Croft, but I will find my own way home." He held up a hand, not to command her, but almost to plead. "Please. It's not what you think. It's logistics. It's practicality. Look outside." He gestured to the window, where the storm was now a full-blown tempest. "It's dangerous out there. I am offering you a safe, dry place to wait out the storm. Nothing more." She stared at him, searching his face for the trick, the angle, the power play. But all she saw was a strange, weary sincerity. For the first time, he looked vulnerable. It was more disarming than his arrogance had ever been. She was trapped. Trapped by the storm. Trapped by her job. And now trapped by this bizarre, unwanted offer of sanctuary from the very man who was the source of her torment. To refuse felt like cutting off her nose to spite her face. The journey home would be long and potentially perilous. To accept felt like a surrender, a step into the lion's den. The choice was taken from her hands. Jean-Pierre reappeared, his face tight with worry. "The police have just issued a flash flood warning for the entire downtown transit system. They are shutting down the subway lines below 34th Street. No one is getting in or out of this part of the city for the next few hours." He looked from Julian to Amara, taking in the scene. "Mr. Croft's offer is perhaps the most sensible solution, Amara." Amara felt the walls closing in. She was bound to him now, not just by his strange obsession, but by the physical reality of the storm. It was forced proximity in its most literal form. Her silent resistance had been defeated by an act of God. She looked at Julian Croft, the man who had tormented her, who had turned her life into a high-stakes psychological game. And she gave a single, reluctant nod. "Fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Fine." He nodded back, a flicker of relief in his eyes. He signed the bill, stood up, and for the first time, he held the door to the service corridor open for her. The simple gesture was so out of character, so contrary to their entire dynamic, that it left her more unsettled than ever. As she walked past him into the unknown, she felt a terrifying premonition. The real storm was not the one raging outside, but the one she was walking into. The journey from Celeste to Julian's residence was 5 blocks of deafening silence. Amara sat stiffly in the back of the Maybach, the buttery leather of the seat feeling alien and decadent against her simple work trousers. She kept her gaze fixed on her own hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The city, distorted by the rain-streaked tinted windows, was a blur of bleeding neon lights. The car moved with a serene, insulated hush, completely sealing them off from the raging storm outside. It was a perfect metaphor for Julian's life, a luxurious, soundproofed bubble, protected from the messy reality of the world. Julian sat on the opposite side, not looking at her, his profile a stark silhouette against the liquid city lights. He seemed to have retreated back into himself, the brief moment of raw vulnerability at the restaurant locked away again. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions and a deep, humming awkwardness. For Amara, this was 100 times more unnerving than his anger. His cruelty she understood. His silence she did not. The car slipped into a private underground garage and came to a silent stop. A private elevator waited for them. As they ascended, Amara felt a growing sense of dread. The sterile, impersonal luxury was escalating, each stage taking her further from her own world and deeper into his. The elevator opened directly into his penthouse. The first thing that struck her was the scale of it. The ceilings were impossibly high, the main living area a cavernous expanse of polished gray concrete, black leather, and chrome. A single dramatic art piece, a chaotic splash of black paint on a vast white canvas, hung on one wall, looking more like a wound than a decoration. The floor-to-ceiling windows on the far side revealed a spectacular, godlike view of the storm engulfing the city. It was magnificent, breathtaking, and as welcoming as a mausoleum. Her own small apartment, with its crowded bookshelves, thriving plants, and colorful, mismatched throws, flashed in her mind. Her home was a collage of life, love, and memory. This place was a monument to emptiness. It wasn't a home, it was a statement. A fortress. She could feel the loneliness seeping from the walls. "The guest suites are this way," Julian said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He led her down a long, stark hallway. The walls were bare. There were no photographs, no personal trinkets, nothing to suggest a life was actually lived here. He stopped at a door and pushed it open. The guest suite was larger than her entire apartment. It was decorated in muted tones of beige and cream, as luxurious and impersonal as a five-star hotel room she could never afford. A king-sized bed was perfectly made. On a chair, a set of neatly folded clothes was laid out, a plain gray sweatshirt and matching sweatpants. "They should fit," he said, his voice flat. "There are toiletries in the bathroom. Everything you need. My driver will be ready to take you home at 8 in the morning, or whenever the storm clears and the transit lines are running again." He was turning to leave when Amara found her voice. "Mr. Croft." He stopped, his back to her. "Why are you doing this?" The question was quiet, but it filled the space between them. He was silent for a long moment, his shoulders rigid. "It's a storm," he finally said, without turning around. "People should be safe in a storm." He walked away without another word, leaving her alone in the silent, opulent room. Amara stood motionless for a long time. The clothes he'd left were soft, anonymous, a gesture of sterile kindness that only made her more uneasy. She showered, the hot water doing little to wash away the tension coiled in her muscles. She changed into the sweatsuit and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling like an imposter. Sleep was an impossibility. Her mind was a whirlwind of the night's events. The confrontation, the forced servitude, the storm, the bizarre offer of shelter from her tormentor. The man was a walking contradiction. A cruel tyrant who berated a waiter over a drop of water, yet offered a safe haven to an employee he despised. People should be safe in a storm. The words echoed in her mind, laced with a significance she couldn't grasp. Restless, she stood up and walked to the door of the suite, cracking it open. The hallway was dimly lit. The penthouse was silent save for the drumming of the rain against the glass. Drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, she crept out. She wasn't snooping, not really. She was just trying to make sense of the place, to find a single human fingerprint in the sterile museum. She drifted down the hall, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. All the doors were closed, perfectly aligned. Except for one. At the very end of the corridor, a door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness in the pristine white wall. It felt like a deliberate imperfection, an oversight in an otherwise meticulously controlled environment. She hesitated, her conscience warring with her curiosity. This was an invasion of privacy. It was wrong. But she was drawn to it, to the one thing that was out of place. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open a few more inches and peered inside. The room was not like the rest of the penthouse. It was a pocket of arrested time. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, sparkling faintly in the dim light filtering in from the hallway. It was a bedroom, but a distinctly feminine one. The furniture was softer, warmer, a carved wooden bed frame, a vanity table with a silver-backed brush set, a chaise lounge draped in a cashmere throw. The air was heavy, stale, smelling of faint, long-faded perfume and memory. This was a room that had been loved and then abandoned. Sealed off. Her eyes were drawn to the vanity table. Amongst the dusty perfume bottles sat a single book, a well-worn collection of Pablo Neruda's poetry. It seemed out of place in Julian's cold world. Acting on instinct, Amara reached out and opened the cover. Inside, on the first page, was a handwritten inscription in elegant, looping script. To my Julian, who builds empires but forgets to plant gardens. May this remind you of where the real treasures grow. All my love, C. Her heart gave a painful throb. My Julian. This was a ghost's room. She gently thumbed through the pages. Tucked between the verses of a love sonnet was a pressed flower. A single, perfectly preserved gardenia, its petals now the color of old ivory. Beneath it, a small, folded note. Her hands trembling slightly, she unfolded it. It was in the same handwriting. Jay, you were impossible tonight. A beautiful, brilliant, impossible man. You work too hard. Your father's voice is too loud in your head. But I saw you tonight, watching the sunset. I saw the man I fell in love with. Don't ever lose him. Please. See. Amara sank onto the dusty chaise lounge, the note clutched in her hand. This note, this room, was a window into another life, another Julian. A Julian who was loved deeply by a woman named C. A Julian who watched sunsets and had a softer side worth fighting for. The cold, cruel billionaire was a facade. The real man had been buried, and this room was his tombstone. In the main living area, Julian stood before the vast window, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. The storm was a mirror, reflecting the tempest inside him. The thunder wasn't just a sound. It was a memory, a visceral echo of another night, another storm, a decade ago. Her name was Clara. The memory rose, unbidden and sharp. He was 24, hungry, already a prodigy in his father's firm. Clara was an artist, a painter. She was his opposite, all warmth and light and messy, vibrant emotion. She was the garden to his empire. Flashback. The memory came in sharp, painful fragments. This same penthouse, though it was different then. Her colorful paintings had leaned against the walls, not yet hung. The air smelled of turpentine and her gardenia perfume. The storm had been just like this one, a furious, end-of-the-world deluge. They were fighting. He'd just closed a ruthless deal, one that had shuttered a family-owned company. He was proud. She was horrified. It's not a victory, Julian, she had shouted, her voice full of a passion he could no longer access. It's a graveyard. You're becoming him. Your father. I'm becoming successful, he'd shot back, his voice cold, echoing his father's lessons. This is how the world works, Clara. You're too sentimental. And you're not sentimental enough, she cried, tears of frustration in her eyes. There has to be a heart in there somewhere, Julian. I know there is. Why do you keep it locked away? He had no answer. He just stood there in his arrogant silence. I can't watch this, she finally said, her voice breaking. I can't watch you turn into a ghost. I'm going to my sister's. I need some air. Don't be dramatic, he'd scoffed. It's a storm. You're not going anywhere. Watch me. She had grabbed her keys and her coat. At the door, she'd paused, looking back at him, her face pleading. Please, Julian. Don't let me go. Just ask me to stay. It was his chance. The moment to drop the armor, to be the man from her note. But his father's voice was too loud. Sentiment is weakness. Control the situation. He thought he was in control. He thought he could let her go, and she would come back, and he would have won the argument. He just shrugged. Drive safe. They were the last words he ever spoke to her. The police called him 2 hours later. A truck had hydroplaned on the bridge. Her small car never stood a chance. The memory shattered, leaving Julian gasping for air in the present, his knuckles white around the glass. He had killed her. Not with his hands, but with his pride. With his ambition. With the hollow, rotten lessons of his father. The empire he'd built since was his penance. His cruelty was his self-flagellation. He made the world as ugly as he felt inside. He pushed everyone away because he knew, with a certainty that was etched onto his soul, that he didn't deserve love. He deserved this. This magnificent, empty tomb. A soft sound pulled him from his waking nightmare. He turned. Amara was standing at the entrance to the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide. She was holding a book. Neruda's poems. Clara's book. For a second, white-hot rage flared in him. She was snooping. She invaded the one sacred space. But the anger died as quickly as it came. He saw the look on her face. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a deep, gut-wrenching comprehension. She hadn't just found a book. She had found his ghost. She had found his wound. He didn't have to ask. He knew where she had been. The carefully constructed walls of his fortress, the ones that had stood for 10 years, crumbled to dust in that single, silent moment. All the arrogance, all the power, all the billions fell away, leaving just a man exposed and broken before her. "The storm," he finally whispered, his voice raspy with unshed tears. "It was a night like this. A storm like this." He looked at her, his gray eyes shimmering with a decade of grief. "It was the night I lost everything that mattered." He didn't say her name. He didn't tell the story. He didn't have to. The truth of it filled the vast, empty room. Amara looked from the book in her hands to the shattered man before her. The monster was gone. In his place was a man drowning in a grief so immense it had reshaped his entire being. Her own anger, her resentment, it all just dissolved. It was replaced by a wave of stunning, painful empathy. She walked slowly towards him and gently placed the book on the marble coffee table between them. She didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She just met his gaze, her own dark eyes full of a quiet, powerful understanding. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words held no pity. They held the simple, profound weight of one human soul acknowledging the pain of another. The fragile bridge of those two words spanned the chasm between them. The storm outside raged on, but for the first time in a very long time, the storm inside Julian Croft was, for just a moment, quiet. The storm broke with the dawn. As the sun rose, it washed the city in a clean, watery gold light, the sky scrubbed clean of its fury. In the silent penthouse, the change in light felt like a benediction, a quiet absolution after a long, dark night of the soul. Amara woke on the guest room bed, not having realized she'd fallen asleep. She was still in the gray sweatsuit, the book of Neruda's poetry lying on the nightstand where she'd placed it. For a moment, she was disoriented, the sterile luxury of the room at odds with the raw, emotional landscape of the night before. Then it all came flooding back. The sealed-off room, the note, the pressed gardenia, and the look of utter devastation on Julian Croft's face. She found him in the kitchen, a sleek, minimalist space of steel and marble that looked as though it had never been used. He was attempting to make coffee with a complicated, industrial-looking espresso machine, and failing. He looked exhausted. The bespoke suit was gone, replaced by a simple black t-shirt and dark pants. Without the armor of his wealth, he looked younger, less formidable. He looked human. He glanced up as she entered, and for a second, a flicker of his old, guarded defensiveness crossed his face. But it was fleeting. He saw her, and then he saw the book on the table between them, and he simply nodded, a gesture of concession. "I have no idea how this thing works," he admitted, his voice raspy. It was the most normal, unassuming sentence she had ever heard him utter. Clara was the one who knew how. She said it was the only machine dramatic enough for her. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it was sad. It was the first time he'd said her name to Amara. Clara. It hung in the air, a name full of love and loss. Amara walked over to the machine. "My first job was at a coffee shop," she said softly. "Let me." She didn't wait for his permission. She found the coffee beans, ground them, and her hands moved with a familiar, competent rhythm. The sharp, rich aroma of fresh coffee began to fill the sterile kitchen, a warm, domestic scent that fought back against the coldness of the space. It was a simple act, but it shifted the dynamic completely. She was no longer his employee, his captive. She was a person helping another person. He watched her, his expression unreadable. As she worked, he spoke, his voice low, as if sharing a secret. "She was a painter," he said, looking at the chaotic black and white art piece on the far wall. "That's not hers. That's mine. Or rather, what I bought after. Hers, her work was all color. So much color it felt loud." He paused, lost in the memory. "She said I lived in a world of black and white spreadsheets, and she was determined to spill paint all over it. She called my ambition a beautiful, terrifying engine. She was always trying to get me to plant gardens." The inscription in the book. Amara's heart ached for him, for the man he might have been. She handed him a steaming mug of coffee. Their fingers brushed, a small spark of contact that felt both impossibly intimate and completely natural. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. He took a sip, his gray eyes looking at her over the rim of the mug. "You were right, you know. That night at the restaurant. About my dissatisfactions. It was a confession, an apology, an admission of everything he had tried so hard to hide. My father used to say that a man who has to shout about how big he is usually feeling very small," Amara said gently, cradling her own mug. He's a mechanic. He can tell everything he needs to know about a man by the way he treats the person servicing his car. Julian leaned against the counter, a wry, self-deprecating smile finally reaching his eyes. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. Then your father would not have a very high opinion of me. He would say there's always time to learn how to be better, she replied simply. They stood there in a comfortable silence, drinking their coffee as the sun climbed higher, flooding the penthouse with morning light. The awkwardness had evaporated, replaced by a fragile, tentative truce. Later, he found some eggs and toast, and they ate a simple breakfast at the huge marble island, the vast, empty space feeling a little less lonely. He asked her about her life, and she told him about her family, about her mother's illness, about her passion for art. She confessed that she hadn't picked up a charcoal pencil in months, too busy working to afford the time for her own dreams. He listened. He didn't offer solutions or pity. He just listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. As the city fully awoke and the transit lines began to run, the spell had to break. It was time for her to go. "My driver will take you," he said, the formality returning slightly. As she gathered her things from the guest room, she saw an envelope on the bed. Inside was a thick stack of cash. More money than she would make in months of tips at Celeste. The old Amara, the one from 2 weeks ago, would have been insulted. She would have seen it as a power play, a payment for services rendered. But the Amara of this morning saw it for what it was, a clumsy, inadequate attempt to say thank you, to make amends for the distress he had caused. It was the only language he was fluent in. She walked back out to the living area. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city, the billionaire's posture returning. She placed the envelope on the table. "This is too much," she said softly. He turned to face her. "It's for the overtime," he said, a hint of their old dynamic in his tone. Then his expression softened. "And the coffee. It was the best I've had in this apartment in 10 years. She smiled, a real, radiant smile. "In that case, you were undercharged." She took out a single $100 bill and left it on the table. "For the dry cleaning on the sweatsuit." His answering laugh was a genuine, startling sound. It was the sound of a window being opened in a sealed room. The drive home was different. The silence wasn't tense, it was thoughtful. When the car pulled up to her modest apartment building, he didn't just let her out. He got out of the car with her. "Amara," he said, his voice serious. "About your art, you shouldn't let that go. The world has enough empires. It could use more gardens." He was echoing Clara's words, but applying them to her. He wasn't trying to replace a ghost. He was encouraging a living, breathing person. It was the most profound compliment he could have given her. "I won't," she promised. She watched him drive away, the sleek black car an alien vessel on her familiar street. She walked into her apartment, which felt warmer and more welcoming than ever. That night, for the first time in a long time, she took out her sketchbook and a stick of charcoal. And she began to draw. A fragile, hopeful bond had been formed, a delicate green shoot pushing its way through solid concrete. The change in Julian was subtle at first, then seismic. The day after the storm, he walked into a board meeting about the Kensington property, the very deal his father had berated him for, and tore up the aggressive acquisition plan. "We're changing the offer," he announced to a stunned room of executives. "The current tenants, the small businesses, the community center, they're part of the asset. We're going to work with them, not evict them. Draw up a new proposal. A partnership." It was professional suicide by his father's standards. It was heresy. For Julian, it was the first brick he was laying in a new garden. He felt a flicker of fear, but it was overshadowed by a heady sense of rightness. He was finally pushing back against the cold, ruthless ghost of his father that lived in his head. Of course, the ghost had spies. News of Julian's radical new sentimentality reached Alistair Croft within hours. Alistair was a man who saw the world as a chessboard, and his son was his most valuable and lately most unpredictable piece. A change this drastic wasn't a shift in strategy, it was a symptom of an infection. And Alistair Croft always moved to eradicate infections before they could spread. He made some calls. He was a master of information. It took him less than a day to find the source. A new waitress. A black girl from a poor neighborhood. An incident at Celeste. An overnight stay at his son's penthouse during a storm. To Alistair, the picture was painfully, predictably clear. A clever, gold-digging opportunist had sunk her claws into his emotionally vulnerable son, filling his head with sentimental nonsense to manipulate him. He had seen it happen to other powerful men. He would not allow it to happen to his heir. He didn't confront Julian. That would be messy, emotional. Alistair preferred surgical strikes. He went straight for the perceived infection. 2 days later, Amara was finishing her shift at Celeste. The past few days had been blessedly quiet. Julian hadn't come in, and she'd taken the space to breathe, to hope. As she was leaving through the staff exit, a gleaming black Rolls-Royce, even more imposing than Julian's Maybach, purred to a stop at the curb. A chauffeur opened the door, and a man stepped out. He was older than Julian, with the same sharp features but colder, harder eyes. He was dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a carapace. He exuded an aura of ancient, absolute power that made Julian seem like a petulant imitation. "Amara Diallo?" he asked. It wasn't a question, it was a summons. Amara's heart began to pound. She knew instantly who this was. Julian's father. "I am Alistair Croft," he said, his voice smooth and cold as polished stone. "I think it's time you and I had a conversation. Get in the car." Fear warred with her pride. Her first instinct was to refuse, to walk away. But there was a chilling certainty in his demeanor that told her he was not a man you said no to. He would only find another, more unpleasant way to have this conversation. Steeling herself, she got into the car. He didn't take her to a restaurant or an office. He had the driver take them to a public park overlooking the river. They sat on a bench, a bizarre island of high-powered tension in a sea of laughing children and strolling couples. "Let's not waste each other's time, Miss Diallo," Alistair began, looking out at the water. "I know who you are. I know your family's financial situation, your mother's health problems. I am a thorough man." The casual mention of her family was a thinly veiled threat, and it landed like a punch to the gut. "My son is going through a difficult period," he continued. "He has certain vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities it seems you have become quite adept at exploiting." "I haven't exploited anyone," Amara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "You don't know anything about what happened." "Oh, I know enough," he said, finally turning to look at her, his eyes devoid of any emotion. "I know that my son was on a path to greatness until he met you. Now he's making sentimental, foolish business decisions that threaten to undo years of my work. You are a distraction, a liability." He reached into his coat and produced a checkbook and a pen. "The question is, what is your price? I find that every problem has a price. Name yours. A number that will solve all your little problems and ensure you disappear from my son's life. Permanently." He was offering to buy her dignity. He was reducing her connection with Julian, their shared moment of vulnerability, to a simple, sordid transaction. The insult was so profound, so dismissive of her very humanity, that it burned away her fear, leaving only pure, white-hot rage. The spirit her mother had told her to protect was under direct assault. She stood up, looking down at the powerful, odious man. "There isn't enough money in your entire empire to buy what you're asking for, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that startled even herself. "You think your son's problem is me? His problem is you. You're the one who turned him into a monster. I just showed him he could be a man." She turned on her heel and walked away, not looking back, her entire body trembling. She had stood up to the king, and she knew there would be consequences. Alistair watched her go, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. The girl had more backbone than he'd expected. It didn't matter. If she wouldn't be bought, she would be broken. He took out his phone and dialed his son. Julian was in his office, looking at the new proposal for the Kensington property, feeling a quiet sense of pride, when his father's name flashed on the screen. He answered, ready for a fight. "I cleaned up your mess," Alistair said, his voice laced with disappointed finality. "What are you talking about?" Julian asked, confused. "The waitress. Amara," his father said, the name dripping with disdain. "I knew she was a problem, so I dealt with it. I offered her a way out, a way to solve her family's financial troubles. I wrote her a check." Julian's blood ran cold. "You did what?" "Don't worry," Alistair said, twisting the knife with surgical precision. "She drove a hard bargain, but she took the money. She's gone, Julian. It's what they always do. They find a weakness, and they press on it until it pays out. Learn from this. Never let sentiment make you a target again." The line went dead. Julian stared at his phone, the words echoing in the silent room. She took the money. She took the money. It couldn't be true. The Amara he'd shared coffee with, the woman who had looked at his grief with such profound empathy, the woman who had left $100 bill for dry cleaning, she wouldn't do that. But the old voices, his father's voices, the ones that had been whispering in his ear for 34 years, roared to life. Sentiment is weakness. Everyone has a price. Trust no one. You are not worthy of genuine connection. His father's lie was a poison perfectly tailored to his deepest wound. It confirmed his ugliest fear, that he was unlovable, a target, and that the one person who had seen behind his mask had only done it to get a better aim. The fragile green shoot of hope that had sprouted in his soul was instantly incinerated. The concrete hardened over it, thicker and more impenetrable than ever before. He stormed out of his office. He drove himself, recklessly, to Celeste. He found her just as she was leaving, by the same staff exit where his father had found her. She saw his car, and for a moment, her face lit up with relief, thinking he had come to stand with her. Then she saw his expression. He got out of the car, slamming the door. The man from the penthouse was gone. This was the monster from that first night, but 100 times worse, because this time his cruelty was fueled by a broken heart. "You," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Julian, what is it?" "I met your father," she started, her voice pleading. "Oh, I know you met him," he sneered, stalking towards her. "He told me all about your little negotiation. So tell me, what was your price? How much is a broken man's soul worth these days? Did you get a good deal?" Amara stared at him, her heart shattering in her chest. The words were a physical blow. He believed his father. After everything they had shared, after that morning in his kitchen, he believed she could be bought. The vulnerability, the connection, the hope, it had all been an illusion. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of rage and a grief so profound it stole her breath. You can't possibly believe that," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why shouldn't I believe it?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's the only thing that makes sense. A girl like you, a man like me. It was never about empathy, was it? It was an investment. And it just paid out. Congratulations. That was it. The final, killing blow." She didn't cry. She didn't scream. A terrifying, cold calm settled over her. The love and empathy she had felt for him curdled into ash. "You're right," she said, her voice flat and dead. "You were right all along." She met his furious, pain-filled eyes. "I quit." She turned and walked away from him, down the dirty city street, leaving him standing there in the wreckage of what he had just destroyed. The shatter point had been reached, the bond obliterated. He had been given a glimpse of a garden, and he had chosen to burn it to the ground. The world for both of them shrank to the size of their own private hells. Amara returned to her small, vibrant apartment, but the colors seemed dull, the air thick with disillusionment. The hug of her home now felt like a suffocation. She had allowed herself to hope. She had opened her spirit to someone, only to have it trampled under the weight of a cynicism so deep it was an abyss. The pain was a physical ache in her chest. It was the sharp, specific grief of being profoundly misunderstood by the one person she thought had finally, truly seen her. For 2 days she drifted. She answered her mother's calls with a forced, hollow cheerfulness. She stared at her blank sketchbook, but the idea of creating anything beautiful felt like a lie. Her hands, which knew how to make coffee and draw life, felt useless. She had a choice. She could let this experience shatter her. She could accept the world was as cruel and transactional as the Crofts believed it to be, and armor her spirit so thick that nothing could ever get in again. Or she could fight. On the third night, she sat at her small kitchen table, the silence pressing in. She looked at the charcoal pencils she had bought with the money she'd earned at Celeste. The job was gone. The hope was gone. But the pencils were still there. Her talent was still there. With a hand that trembled slightly, she picked one up. She opened her sketchbook. And she began to draw. She didn't draw a flower or a landscape. She drew a face. Julian's. But she didn't draw the monster who had spewed venom at her on the sidewalk. She drew the man in the penthouse kitchen, his eyes clouded with a decade of grief, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. She drew the flicker of a genuine smile, the vulnerability in his gaze as he'd listened to her talk about her father. She drew the memory of the man, not the pain of his actions. It was an act of profound, painful empathy. It was her way of processing the truth, of separating the wounded man from the weapon he had allowed himself to become. She was choosing not to let his darkness extinguish her light. Her choice was to hold on to her own spirit, even if it meant grieving for the man he had failed to be. Julian's hell was a vast, opulent, and silent one. He was back in the penthouse, but the brief warmth they had created was gone. The silence was louder than ever, mocking him. The victory over Amara was the most desolate loss of his life. He had proven his father right, and in doing so, had sentenced himself to a lifetime in this beautiful, empty prison. He drank. He tried to work. But the image of Amara's shattered face on the sidewalk was burned into his mind. He found himself standing outside the sealed door to Clara's room, his hand on the knob, unable to enter. He had failed her memory. He had become the ghost she had feared. The doubt began as a whisper. She didn't even defend herself. She just looked broken. Why wouldn't she fight if she were guilty? Why wouldn't she gloat? The pieces didn't fit. His father's version of the story was clean, simple. The reality of Amara, her quiet pride, her fierce integrity, the way she left the $100 bill was messy and complicated. Julian Croft was a man who dealt in data, in proof. His entire empire was built on forensic analysis of facts. For the first time, he realized he had accepted his father's accusation on pure, emotional faith. Faith in a cynical, broken worldview. He hadn't seen a single piece of evidence. The thought galvanized him. He made a call, not to his father, but to the head of his personal security team, a man whose only loyalty was to Julian's paycheck. "I want everything you can find on a meeting between my father and a woman named Amara Diallo 2 days ago," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear for the first time in days. "Surveillance footage, audio, financial forensics. I want to know if any money changed hands. Any accounts. I want to know what was said. I want the absolute truth. Now." He paced the penthouse like a caged tiger while he waited. He was choosing to reject the story he'd been told and find the facts for himself. Hours later, an encrypted file arrived on his laptop. He opened it. There it was. Grainy CCTV footage from a camera across the street from the park. His father on a bench. Amara. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see everything. He saw his father's dismissive, imperious gestures. He saw Amara's posture, stiff with outrage. He saw her stand, her face a mask of furious pride. He saw her turn and walk away, her back ramrod straight. Then came the financial report. A thorough trace of his father's accounts and hers. There were no transfers. No checks cashed. No secret deposits. Nothing. She had taken nothing. It had all been a lie. A calculated, cruel lie designed by his father to keep him in his cage. The realization hit him with the force of a physical impact, knocking the wind out of him. His father hadn't just lied. He had used Julian's deepest wound, the loss of Clara, as a weapon against him. But the wave of anger at his father was immediately eclipsed by a tidal wave of self-loathing. He had believed it. He had wanted to believe it, because it was easier to live in a world of monsters than to accept the terrifying, beautiful possibility of a garden. He hadn't just pushed Amara away. He had taken her light, her empathy, her spirit, and he had tried to extinguish it with the ugliest words he could find. He had become his father. He sank to the floor, the polished concrete cold against his skin. This was his rock bottom. He looked at the door to Clara's room, at the book of poetry on the table. He could stay here. He could accept his fate as the king of this empty castle, forever haunted by the ghosts of the women he had failed. Or he could make a different choice. He could do the one thing he had never done. Not for Clara. Not for anyone. He could fight for it. He could choose vulnerability over pride. Truth over armor. He could try to mend the garden he had torched. He stood up, his body moving with a new, desperate purpose. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him. He knew he didn't deserve it. But he had to try. He had to show her the man he was choosing to be, not the one he was raised to be. He strode out of the penthouse, leaving the whiskey and the ghosts behind. He didn't call his driver. He walked out into the living, breathing city and hailed a yellow cab, a king willingly dethroning himself. He gave the driver an address in Brooklyn, his heart pounding with a terrifying, exhilarating mixture of hope and fear. He was choosing her. Now, she had to choose whether to even open the door. The taxi ride to Brooklyn was a journey across a border, from his world to hers. The skyscrapers gave way to brownstones, the sterile quiet of his neighborhood replaced by the vibrant hum of life. Music drifting from open windows, the chatter of people on their stoops, the distant laughter of children. It was real. It was alive. It was everything his penthouse wasn't. Each block brought him closer to his judgment, and with every turn, the armor of his wealth and power melted away, leaving only a raw, terrified nerve of a man. He paid the driver, a simple, normal transaction that felt monumental, and stood on the sidewalk, staring up at her building. It was a modest 4-story walk-up with overflowing flower boxes on the windowsills. It had more character and warmth in its worn brick facade than his entire 68-story glass tower. For the first time, he felt poor. Not in money, but in spirit. He was an alien here, a ghost from a colder planet, and he was about to ask for asylum. Taking a breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of his heart, he entered the building and climbed the 3 flights of stairs. The air smelled of garlic and laundry detergent and life. His hand trembled as he raised it to knock on her door. The number 3 be painted in a cheerful, slightly crooked script. The sound of his knuckles on the wood was a gunshot in the quiet hallway. It was the sound of surrender. He waited. For a full minute, there was nothing. He was about to turn away, to accept this as his deserved fate, when he heard the slide of a deadbolt. The door opened, and there she was. Amara stood in the doorway, a charcoal pencil in her hand, a smudge of black on her cheek. She was wearing a simple t-shirt and worn jeans. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Her eyes, those deep, expressive pools of dark chocolate, widened in shock, then immediately narrowed into a wall of ice. The hope and empathy he had seen in them were gone, replaced by a deep, weary pain. "What do you want, Julian?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The absence of Mr. Croft was a statement in itself. They were no longer employee and boss. They were just a man and a woman, with a chasm of hurt between them. He opened his mouth, but the eloquent, cutting words he was used to had abandoned him. He was left with the clumsy, honest vocabulary of a broken man. "I was wrong," he managed, his voice hoarse. "I came here to," he swallowed, forcing the words out. "I came to apologize." "You did that already," she said, her arms crossing over her chest. "You apologized for being a monster by becoming an even bigger one. I'm not interested in a third act." "No," he said, shaking his head, taking a half-step closer, a supplicant at her gate. "That wasn't an apology. That was me breaking. I didn't come to make excuses. I came to tell you the truth." He told her everything. He told her about his father's call, the perfectly crafted lie. He told her how he'd had it investigated, how he'd seen the footage, the proof of her innocence. He didn't try to soften his own role. He owned it completely. "He loaded the gun," Julian said, his voice cracking. "But I'm the one who pulled the trigger. I'm the one who said those unforgivable things to you." He knew exactly what lie to tell, because he's the one who built the cage I live in. But I'm the one who chose to believe him. I believed him because it was easier than believing you. Her expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. He pressed on, the confession spilling out of him now. "It was easier to believe you were a monster than to believe that someone as good as you could actually see something worthwhile in someone as broken as me. It terrified me. The way you looked at me that morning, it felt like hope. And I have spent my entire life learning that hope is a liability. So I destroyed it. I destroyed us. Because I didn't think I deserved it." He finally looked down, unable to bear the intensity of her gaze. "I don't deserve it," he whispered. "But I'm asking anyway." For a long time, the only sound was the faint hum of the city outside. Amara's arms uncrossed. She looked at the shattered man in her doorway, a man who had been stripped of all his power and pride, leaving only a core of profound regret. This was the man she had drawn. This was the man she had grieved for. With a deep sigh, she stepped back, opening the door wider. It was an invitation. He walked into her apartment, and it was like stepping into her soul. It was warm, vibrant, and filled with books and art and life. On a small table, her sketchbook lay open. He saw it instantly. The drawing. His face, captured in charcoal, his eyes full of the grief he'd carried for a decade. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He looked from the drawing to her, his own eyes filling with tears. "You drew this after? After what I said to you?" She nodded, her expression softening for the first time. "I had to," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I had to remember there was a man inside the monster. Otherwise, the monster would have won." The simple, profound grace of her words broke him. He finally understood. Her strength wasn't in her defiance, it was in her empathy. It was a power so immense it could look at pure ugliness and still find the faint outline of a human heart. He walked over to her, his movements slow, deliberate. He stopped just before her, their two worlds finally colliding in this small, sacred space. "That night at the restaurant," he began, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze locked with hers. "You said the only imperfection at the table was the lack of human decency being shown. You were wrong." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently, tentatively, took hers. Her fingers were warm. "The imperfection was me. All of it. I was a tidal wave of pain, and I crashed right into you. He squeezed her hand, a silent plea. I'm done with the storm, Amara. I want to learn how to plant gardens. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry now welled in her eyes, one spilling over and tracing a slow path down her cheek. She looked at their joined hands, at this man who had come back from the wreckage, not with demands, but with a confession and a promise. She saw the truth of his transformation in his eyes. She looked up at him, her voice quiet but clear. Gardens need time to grow, she said softly. And they need a lot of work. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty. It wasn't a surrender. It was a challenge. And it was a yes. A smile of pure, unadulterated relief broke across Julian's face, a radiant sun after a decade of winter. It reached his eyes, and for the first time, they weren't stormy gray, but the color of a clear morning sky. I'm a hard worker, he said, his voice full of a hope so powerful it was almost painful. And I promise I'm a fast learner. He gave a small, hesitant smile. But I think I might need a good teacher. He glanced towards her small kitchen. Is there any chance you'd be willing to teach me how to make coffee again? Properly this time. Amara's answering laugh was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of forgiveness. The sound of a new beginning. Their story didn't end there, it began. The following weeks saw a quiet revolution. Julian promoted Jean-Pierre and bought a significant stake in Celeste, not as a power play, but to institute new staff welfare policies, with Leo on the new committee. The Kensington property was transformed, with Julian's capital and Amara's vision, into a thriving community arts center, which Amara ran, her charcoal-stained fingers finally guiding others. The penthouse slowly transformed, too. Her vibrant, colorful canvases began to replace the stark black and white art. Houseplants appeared on the windowsills, thriving in the morning light. The sealed door to Clara's room was finally opened, not to be erased, but to be honored as a memory, a part of the history that had, in its own tragic way, led him to Amara. It was no longer a tomb. It was a home. One evening, months later, they found themselves back on the rooftop of Celeste. Not as a patron and a waitress, but as partners. They sat at table 12, holding hands across the pristine white linen, the city lights glittering below like scattered jewels. The imperfection was gone. In its place was a connection forged in fire, a love born not from perfection, but from the shared, messy, beautiful work of healing. He was a man who had owned the world, but had nothing. She was a woman who had nothing but owned herself. And together, they had finally, truly found everything. We've all encountered people who use anger or arrogance as a shield for their own pain. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies in our ability to see past the storm and recognize the person struggling within it. Have you ever given someone a second chance and been surprised by their capacity to change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We can all learn from each other's experiences with forgiveness and empathy. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.